Hey folks, welcome to a special new YouTube series. It's a collaboration between Nebulab and Your Basket is Empty. And what we're trying to do here is we want to try and get away from the standard e-com topics. So we're going to try and avoid lifetime value, performance, Black Friday strategies, etc. Not that those things aren't great, but we want to rather try and explore and discuss what's happening at the fringes of the weirder spaces in the digital commerce market. And we want to highlight topics, people, and brands who are doing kind of unusual things. And we're going to do it with a very simple format. It's going to be one topic split into 4 5-minute segments, and it's going to be delivered by YouTube straight to your ears and your eyes every 2 weeks. And the first topic is Web3 right shifting. Alessandro, welcome. How are you and where are you?
Hey, Tim. Good to be here. Good. Recovering from a cold that I've had over the last few days. So hopefully my usual ramblings will not be more over the place than they usually are. But yeah, I'm good otherwise. I'm in Rome in my home office.
Nice. Maybe it's not a bad idea that there's a few pharmaceuticals running around your brain. We might get a slightly more
Oh, yeah.
lucid conversation. Yeah. Given that the
That helps.
topic of this, and given that the kind of the general direction of travel here is the weirder spaces in e-commerce, us, being on some pharmaceuticals
Exactly.
might help us. Yeah. So we want to kind of tackle Web3, which I think is an interesting topic because let's be honest, it's kind of fallen out of favor, I would argue, right? Like generally speaking.
Yeah.
However, you've been doing some interesting insights and thinking, and we were talking about it just before we kind of jumped on this live YouTube chat about kind of Web3.
Yeah.
I think, though, we should rewind a little bit. So what did you think about Web3 18 months ago? And have you seen a technology garner that much traction? I'm going to put another caveat in there, bar AI.
Yeah. So yeah, AI definitely beats them all. I would say Web3 is a close contender. I think it has definitely evolved over the last few years in some ways that were easy to anticipate and others that were not so easy. So if you look, first of all, Web3 as a concept, I would say, is a quite recent thing, but the contents of that concept have been around for a pretty long time. We've had the Second Life for forever. I don't know when it was born exactly, but it still has like 200k active daily users. We have Fortnite. Those are all like primitive versions of the metaverse, and then blockchain, NFTs, cryptocurrency. Those have been around for a while, and I think it has gone through a very similar trend as many other technologies, where a few years ago you only really had a couple of different categories of companies building in this space. You had the giants that have very large R&D budgets to sustain that kind of innovation, and they also have the gravitational pull, right? They have enough of a customer base to pull enough segments into those kind of experiences. And then you have the disruptors, the small brands that were born breeding and leaving that ecosystem and draw their inspiration and then their strength from it. But then what usually happens, and what's happened with Web3, is these concepts start to gain traction and they become a thing, and we put a name to things. And when you do that, when you draw a box around the thing, people start to build products and build careers around the technology.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets very exciting, right? You accelerate innovation dramatically, but you also start seeing a lot of situations where the technology is being applied in extreme or sometimes borderline idiotic ways. So you had an interesting post on LinkedIn about the StockX Apple Vision Pro up a few days ago. I think that's one example that is a bit out there, probably.
Yeah, agreed.
And yeah, we've seen the same thing unfold with Web3. And then also the financial nature of it led to a lot of speculation, led to some illegal things being done at times. And the pandemic also accelerated it. So it was the perfect opportunity to talk about digital society, a digital economy. And after it was what it was. So also saw a sharp deceleration. And we had this crash and this moment of disillusionment. And I think that we're only now starting to recover from that a little bit, but it is still early. And I'm not sure if that tracks with some of the stuff that you've been seeing as well.
It definitely does. And I think you make a really good point that I've not thought about, and the correlation between Web3 and COVID and the fact that we were all at home in a kind of this weird physical and digital bubble, how much that impacted that kind of trajectory that you kind of talked about. My sense is that, and maybe it's because of the experience of Web3 and COVID and so forth, but AI seems to not have that, if you project forward, that sort of risk of dropping. It just feels like it's going to go and go and go, right? And I don't think, I remember thinking about the Web3 at the time and just thinking, nah, there's no, like, do you know what I mean? It didn't have the same kind of like long-term application that kind of AI has.
I think that's true to an extent. I think what we're seeing with AI right now is a suspension of disbelief in some areas where some of these products are not particularly good, if we want to be honest, but we're all willing to buy into this collective belief that they will be good eventually. And it is the exact same thing that happened with the metaverse. I don't know if you remember Zuckerberg's avatar not having legs. At some point, right. Their whole like product roadmap was we are going to put legs on those metaverse avatars. And we were all willing to believe that they would get there and then they would get to the next step. And to some extent, I think it is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you are willing to put your money and your energy into that, it will happen eventually. But in the meantime, you need to have enough traction and enough breathing room for the technology to fail, to experiment with very crazy stuff, to do things that do not make sense. And so I think some of the extreme outlandish applications of Web3, as crazy and ridiculous as they seem at times, they are a necessary step.
Totally, yeah. So we're going to try and cover sort of 4 questions in 5 minutes. I feel like we've gotten probably through 1.5 of them there. So the next section we want to talk about is Kiki. So I'm curious, first of all, we'll get into the interview you did with the co-founder and chief product officer, Brendan. But like, why do you think a brand like Kiki is able to maintain Web3 relevance now? And maybe as a little sidestep, you might want to sort of introduce to the audience, like, what Kiki doing from a Web3 perspective?
Yeah, so Kiki is this small, very cool brand that I've been following for a while. Does very interesting thing with co-creation and Web3, where basically they have this concept of a campaign, and a campaign is a survey that they run for their whole community or anyone who wants to participate, where they ask questions about what they should do in their product roadmap. So, for instance, what kind of nail polish color they need to release next. And you can vote on that. And if you vote, you get an NFT. And if you happen to vote on the option that wins, you also get a discount to buy that product, and you get royalties on future sales. So I think that's all very fascinating, and I've been following them for a while. And then they subscribed to that Nebulab newsletter, and I got that notification. So I took the chance to reach out and interview their CPO.
Nice.
Yeah, that was very cool. And I think what they're getting right is going back to my previous point, that they have found that perfect middle ground between experimenting with something that is new, but also having a very valuable use case, right? It is something that makes sense. It is a natural fit for the technology, but it's also a natural fit for their business model. And in terms of marketing, they communicate differently depending on the audience that they're engaging with. So if it's a Web2 community, they are trying to abstract away a lot of the complexity. If it's Web3, then they try to lean a bit more heavily into the technicality of it. And I think that's sort of like double-edged approach is the key to succeeding in very novel, very sophisticated spaces like Web3 is today.
Yeah, I think that's so fascinating. You're right. Like it's to me, and it was funny because when we were thinking about doing this conversation, you sent me Kiki. I'm like, I've heard about these guys before, and I'd written about it in no, sorry, Will and I, when we were doing our kind of like weekly roundup of ecom stuff, we had picked up on that feature that they'd done like a few months ago. So yeah, it's cool to be talking about them again. I totally agree. Like when we talked about it originally, Will and I, and again, I'll echo it here. It's kind of cool. And some things that are cool are totally useless, and that's fine. That's cool, but it's cool and useful, right? Like, so that's an interesting sort of like middle ground. And the fact that I didn't realize about the segmentation in the way in which they talk to their customers is like a Web 2 sort of persona and a Web 3. And that does make sense. I imagine also their Web 3 customer 2024 is probably really hardcore, right? Because they probably would have flushed out a bit of the sort of like people that were kind of interested in it but really weren't. So therefore, their Web3 2024 customer is probably highly engaged in that particular topic and a very specific persona.
Yeah, exactly. I would say there's been a bit of a polarization of the space in a good way, because when these things tend to happen, when trends lose steam in a natural, organic way, what happens is everyone that was only interested in the trend for speculation or because they think that it's a next big thing and they want to build a career out of it, they leave the space and you're left with the, I don't want to say believers, but let's use that word. You're left with the believers that really want to innovate and are willing to do what it takes to get to a meaningful outcome for business, for society, for economy, whatever it is that they're building. And then that's for the niche brands. For the larger brands, they have the ability to take something that is very novel and try to bring it to the masses because they have enough of a marketing weight to be able to make that happen. And so I think that we need both of those players in Web3, but really with any other technical trend moving forward.
And then before we get on, I wasn't sure if you were saying believers, like Justin Bieber fans, calling them believers, which is I mean that's a separate topic. But the interview you did with Brendan, then I'm curious, and we'll pop it in the kind of show notes here in the links to go and check out the newsletter discussion you had. But was there anything that surprised you when you had that conversation with him?
I think besides everything that I've mentioned, because I went into that interview, I would say I was a bit biased. Like I was expecting a brand of hardcore Web3 believers, to use my previous term. And instead I was surprised that they were very balanced in how they view the space. So that's definitely one element. I would say the other thing is, to some extent in this particular case, it was a necessity, but it is very rare and it is exceedingly rare to find brands that are willing to build their own technology, to find consumer brands that are not enterprise that are willing to build their own technology. Maybe a bit less so in Europe, but especially in the US, it is not something that you talk about. It's not something that you do. It is not considered socially acceptable to talk about a consumer brand building their own software. And usually what happens is you just use whatever the almighty gods of e-commerce provide to you, and then you call it a day. And it's often the right call. We have seen brands in the past build immense amounts of custom software when it was not really warranted. And foundational e-commerce stuff is largely commoditized today. So that's very often the right call. But going back to my previous point, if you find a valuable use case that enables a meaningful business model or allows it to be more competitive, then you'd be crazy not to take that chance. And that's exactly what Kiki is doing. And they're also taking it one step further, which is they are planning to release that technology and make it available for other brands to use, which I think is really fascinating. And it is also a very good way to drive adoption. It is one thing to build software, and then that's your business model, and you try to sell that software. It is a wildly different thing when you are an operator in the space, and then you do something and you make it available to other operators. That I think that what we've seen is that dramatically increases adoption. Some of the most successful tools in ecom have been built by operators or ex-operators, and they just come with a different level of credibility, but also, I would say, usefulness in how they try to approach the market. So I think that's very, very interesting and very uncommon for consumer brands today.
Maybe that balance that you talk about is reflective in the use case of what they're doing. The fact that they have a balanced view internally of this stuff means that what they're developing and the sort of use case that you've given, the kind of like the NFT/loyalty program where kind of customers involved and they get a like royalty. Therefore, that's why it is so useful, because of their I suppose like internal culture or whatever, right? Like that's kind of
absolutely. Yeah, the fact that they are trying to appeal to both of those audiences in a way that speaks very directly to both of them, I think that's the key in being relevant in the technology that you're building as well. And yeah, that's incredibly interesting.
Right, we've got about 4 minutes left. Let's talk about predictions. So what's a prediction for Web3 right shifting in the future? We might also want to talk about Sephora's Web3, kind of the Sephora-verse that kind of recently got announced. Yeah. I saw another thing also. Mango were doing something with Roblox. I think that was a kind of a thing I saw recently. Mango, the brand, they've got some sort of Roblox thing. Yeah. But anyway, over to you. What's your predictions?
So I think we'll definitely see more Kikis moving forward. We'll see more brands adopt Web3 in a way that is very intentional, very meaningful. I think there are some interesting trends and future developments that are slowly leading us in that direction. So the one very direct thing is institutions calling for more transparency on the supply chain side. In Europe, we have a big thing right now around digital product passports or digital product IDs, and Web3, the blockchain, NFTs are actually a very good natural fit for solving some of those challenges. We have luxury brands that are very active compared to everyone else in the Web3 space, both with one-time activations or permanent programs. So a lot of Web3 brands, luxury brands, are either collaborating or doing their own stuff in Web3. And then the other thing that is a bit more out there, but I think will be a factor eventually, is what we've witnessed over the last few years. And I think that was started with social media, but it's now moving into other areas, is a fading line between consumers and creators, where it becomes more of a give and take. And the general Web3 philosophy is very aligned with that sort of relationship between brand and consumer. And Kiki is one example of that. But you also interviewed the founders of Sorcery, I believe it was called, that uses consumer feedback to inform product discovery. So that's also like very interesting use case where you are a consumer, but you are also in a way contributing to that brand being discovered by other people. So you are playing an active part in marketing that brand, right? So I think that's very interesting. And yeah, I think all of this will eventually lead in the direction of better tooling, better interoperability among Web3 ecosystems, which is a problem right now, and more valuable use cases. And something like the Web3 experience from Sephora that you have highlighted on LinkedIn, I think is a very good example of that, where the philosophy is Web3, but the technology behind it is really Web2. It is a bridge to get there. It is not the ultimate thing.
I think that's a great way to end the first YouTube series, Nebulab, Your Basket is Empty collab. Alessandro, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.